Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Heidi Schiller, and I'm a librarian here at the North Vancouver City Library. I want to start off by apologizing for the lack of wine. I know I advertised that there would be wine and snacks at 6:30. It's entirely my fault. In the 4 years of doing this author series, I have never forgotten to get a liquor license, but I did that this time, and so it's all my fault, and I apologize. But if you come to our next author reading, there will be plenty of wine there, I promise. And I've heard that some of the authors have little flasks of things in their purses. I'm just kidding, totally kidding. So welcome, we're very excited for our two local authors this evening, Nancy Lee and Jackie Bateman. I'm going to first hand the mic over to Kathy Scrimshaw from the North Shore Writers Association, and she is going to introduce Jackie.
Thank you, Heidi. It's my pleasure to be here tonight to introduce Jackie Bateman. She is the author of Nondescript Rambunctious, and that was the first of the Lizzie trilogy. I just finished reading that book about 3 days ago, and I'm just astounded at the talent that's shown in that book. With Nondescript Rambunctious, Jackie won a first novel contest it ran across Canada, so best first novel in Canada, amazing. She's been a member of the North Shore Writers since 2013, and she tells me she's always been a writer at heart. Like all of us, she's got a first practice manuscript at home in the closet, and she did start writing the Lizzie trilogy on her first maternity leave, which again astounds me. I think anyone who can be on maternity leave looking after a little baby and writing an award-winning novel all at the same time just deserves an enormous amount of praise. Now, Jackie tells me she's always been fascinated by the dark side of the human character, and that's definitely what the Lizzie trilogy is all about. She said she's attracted to the most gruesome stories in the news media, and oh yes, Nancy too. And there's lots of those to go around. So for someone to turn that into a novel is just, again, absolutely fascinating. Now, Nondescript Rambunctious is about a psychopath and his victims. And in Jackie's hands, the characters are definitely not stereotypes. She teases the reader and gives us little bits of information in each chapter and gradually builds a story, and you're just gripped by it. She takes us right inside the head of her stalker and of his victim, and just amazing story. And I have to tell you this, by the end of the novel, I was cheering for the psychopathic serial killer because I loved who he chose for his last victim. I thought it was perfect. So please join me in welcoming Jackie Bateman as she reads from the second installment in the Lizzie trilogy. It's called Savor.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kathy. This is my first sober reading. Sorry if it's going to be a bit boring, at least I won't be slurring. I'm going to split up the reading into two different perspectives. My books are all, they switch points of view, basically, so I thought it was fitting that we have at least a couple of them. That makes it sound like I'm going to read forever, and I'm not, I promise. Some people tell me they feel a little uncomfortable about being in the mind of a killer, but as a writer, I think that's one of the most interesting perspectives to work on. You know, what makes them tick. In reality, they're not straightforward, clue-leaving narcissists like getting all the detective series. Well, not all of them, but some of them. You know, they're complex characters with doubts and weaknesses and strengths, just like any of us. And so as I've lived with my characters, I've realised that, you know, they're not necessarily what we expect, and they're intricate, and sometimes they're pretty unpredictable, even to me when I'm writing them. And so the first character, well, the first perspective I'm going to read is Oliver. He's my obsessively minded killer. Spinner, spinner. He was threatening you, getting in my way, and I couldn't have it. Helen was one thing, but I would not for 1 second longer have someone as low as Spinner take any piece of you away from me. It seemed everyone wanted you, and it was making my skin burn. He was already in my bad books, mooching around Soho, leaving his rancid trail. He boasted to me once about working the market for potentials, being the main man there, and I'd never fully trusted his promise that he wouldn't touch you. Admittedly, there was a short period when he was sniffing around in my behalf, but since the circle disbanded, I'd had little use for him. Let me run through the details of that fateful morning when he dared to touch what belongs to me. Before breakfast, I wandered down to Old Compton Street, keeping a lookout for his swagger, for I'd vowed to keep an eye on him. The stench of the cafe bins was already starting to seep into the morning air, the clack of office shoes filling the streets. The working doldrums of London is something I could never think of entering myself, all that false money and self-importance, the revolting rush of everyday life with no end in sight. I didn't pay too much attention to the plastic briefcases, the floral scarves, or worst of all, the suits worn with running shoes to be changed upon arrival at the office like in a terrible American movie. When I got to Charing Cross Road, I saw him. He was coming out of a cafe, surprisingly early for him, takeaway cup in hand, and staring at that dreadful phone of his, thumb working away. It could possibly be at the other end of his inane texting or emailing or whatever it is he did with that thing. Who would be interested? I followed him towards Wardour Street when he stopped outside the Duke of Wellington and stared like he'd seen something important. It was your young friend being dropped off by her mother. I had to watch from the distance while he pounced on her and cornered her like a frightened animal. I don't care much about your friend, but it was a foolish move for many reasons, not least because we'd used her in the audacious already. I didn't want her memory to be jogged by his spongy face, his odious presence. Then you appeared, and things entered a different realm. I held back, furious, as he laid his greasy hands on you. I didn't want you or your friend to see me, but when he held you by the throat and put his lips against yours, I couldn't help but begin to step forward. But you got away, Lizzie, of your own accord. You were as feisty as ever, pulling your friend away, even using my name as a threat. I was impressed. You escaped, of course you did, and I didn't have to expose myself. I stayed in the shadows and waited to make sure you were a safe distance away from that lowlife. I spent the night thinking about his gold embellishments, the tightness of his jeans over his nauseating crotch bulge and his ego growing out of control. I drank my usual, the Macallan 12-year-old, from my favourite crystal glass, filtered ice cubes making that pleasant little clink as I made circles with it in my palm. I pondered what to do with him. My home in London looks out over the Thames, Lizzie. Sometimes I imagine you here with me, enjoying the view. I'm no entrepreneur, but I've made some wise real estate decisions over the years, and although my apartment is a modest one, I can see St Paul's Cathedral on the other side of the river. I can sit under a heated lamp on my deck and enjoy the feeling of being on top of the city, in rather a godlike position of power. From here, I like to think of you out there somewhere, and then I can swoop down when it takes my fancy and pick you up. Nothing's in my way. I have 2 vantage points and 2 settings on my inner lens. My home is the wide-angled lookout where I can survey the bigger picture and make decisions. The flat above the market is the detail-oriented hawk's nest where I can hone in. From the big picture position, I decided what I'd do. It was that vulgar, so-called kiss that did it. That was the tipping point. It was the anguish he caused you when he put his hands on you. I resolved that he had to go. This morning, I waited for him. It didn't take long for him to find me, sipping tea outside one of the street cafes. You're the best person to help me, I told him. The only one who can handle a new project to replace the circle. He was needed for the most vital part in my plan. Flattery makes someone like him as malleable as putty, so easy to manipulate and knead into shape. I watched as he puffed out his chest and ruffled his feathers, thrilled with his own importance. Then he came with me down to the south bank to the deliciously dark tunnels, the disused skateboard park, and the empty gardens on top of the festival theatre. I told him I wanted to show him some new areas for abduction. What he didn't realise was that it was he who would be the victim. Locals were advised not to send children to the far end of the gardens alone. Tourists don't know the gardens are there because they never look up, only down at their beige clothing and the pecking pigeons at their feet. There are tools, sandbags, mounds of earth. Have you ever wondered why it feels dangerous there? Because, my dear Lizzie, it is. I've seen to it that his weighted body will never rise to the surface of the Thames. However, each night, as I sip my whisky, I can almost see the shadow of him rippling the dark waters, and sometimes, to the discerning eye, there's a glint of gold. So that's the main killer in the book. He's full of quite dark, sometimes humorous hatred of most things. I've always been quite interested in the obsessive mind, and wanted to make him quite complex. So, as well as killing people, he likes order, and he likes control. He likes to feel he owns Lizzie, our main protagonist, and he has power over her. He doesn't want anyone else to have her. And so he battles with this paradox where he wants to kill her, but he also wants to protect her. And I kind of like the complexity in that. Characters like Oliver, they're not interested in leaving clues behind for notoriety and fame, for people to figure out, resolutions to happen. He just likes the feeling that he gets from killing, from watching others suffer, and that person's the worst kind because they're the people that never get found. I've always wondered what lies beneath the surface of this strange, narcissistic world we live in, because we only get to see a little bit of it, a little tip of it in the news. But who are all the people who don't get discovered? I think that's a bit of a scary thought. So on that cheery note, I'll read my second perspective. Helen. So this is Helen. Helen had been in bed for almost a week. She only knew this because the midday news was telling her that it was Friday, not because she'd been keeping any sort of tally. She'd collapsed into oblivion last weekend, and the days had uneventfully merged into each other. At first she basked in the glory of the viewing at the Audacious. Then as the days passed, her skin began to itch again, her mind shutting down with a lack of stimulus. Most of the time she was unaware of the clock or the sun or the moon. The curtains remained drawn, and she ate only when her stomach told her she had to. The bedsheet smelled of her unwashed hair, she realised, but it wasn't an unpleasant thing, this cocoon of herself. The television came into focus. A newsreader with a stiff blonde bob and a fake smile was telling London about another incident on the tube, more pointless deaths, just another day. Helen shifted slightly, just enough to be able to make a gun with her fingers and shoot at the screen. Her right leg was still aching for no apparent reason despite the painkillers. There was nothing to get up for, to stretch it out. The ache was inside, in her bones, and she wondered if something more sinister was wrong. The next viewing at the Audacious was this Monday night, after a long wait. The circle often gathered on a Monday. The beginning of the week meant there were fewer people around to witness anyone going into the building, and less trouble generally. On Friday and Saturday nights, the police were always patrolling, looking for something to kick off. She got out of bed, another twinge of pain shooting down her shin. She'd go outside for a walk, feed the ducks maybe, before diving back into hibernation for the rest of the weekend. Perhaps exercise would relieve this relentless ache. She put on her coat over the leggings and t-shirt that she'd been wearing for several days. No point in changing into clean clothes before she'd showered. The world would have to make do with her just the way she was. As she left the flat, a wave of excitement drifted out with her. The positive thing about her dreary existence was that time disappeared without much of a bother, and before she knew it, the next viewing would be looming. She emptied out the plastic bag of broken up bread into the pond and scrunched it up in her pocket. The ducks pecked and flapped, happy with what they were given, and how they were given it. No need to make a show of the delivery. Reflections in the woods were shimmering in the sunlight. There was no one else around, and she felt calm in her solitude. Lifting her face to a touch of warmth from the sky, she closed her eyes and listened to the delicate splashes and squawking coming from the pond. She sat. There was no one. It was so quiet. Then there was a voice behind her. "You all right, missus?" Helen sat up straight, felt some saliva on one side of her face, her fingers cold on her skin. Time had passed again, without her realising. "I thought you was dead for a minute." A man walked around to face her. She didn't answer, wiping her face with her coat sleeve in case there were other signs of her temporary disappearance. The man looked harmless enough, a middle-aged construction worker in orange overalls, probably on his way home from work. She tried to smile, but wasn't sure if it looked like a grimace. "You look terrible, darling. Were you asleep? You need to get yourself home and warmed up a bit." He looked at his watch as if he was late. "Yes, I will do." She rubbed at her right leg as it stiffened up again. "What's a hand getting up?" He came closer. "No!" She had shouted a bit. It wasn't intentional, but she didn't like strangers in close proximity, even if they were trying to help her. It just come out that way. "Keep your hair on. I was just trying to help," he said, as he went on his way, shaking his head. Helen could hear his thoughts. They sprang out of his head and found their way over to her. "She's not all there, the poor woman," and "you can't help some people." She turned and hobbled in the opposite direction, towards the bus stop, with a sudden urge to go somewhere, any place, away from here.
Thank you, Jackie. I guess you will have to read the book to find out how it's Helen. I don't have high hopes for Helen. Before I introduce Nancy, I would like to just mention that on all of your seats, I placed one of these programming guides. This has all of our course information, all of our events, book clubs, programs for teens, all of that kind of stuff is in here. And if you would like, you can sign up for our monthly e-newsletter as well. That sign-up sheet is on the back by the water over there, where the wine is supposed to be, but it's not. Okay. Nancy Lee lived her early years in England before immigrating to Canada. She received her M.F.A. creative writing from the UBC and has taught at the Simon Fraser University Writing and Publishing program. She's also the former associate director of the Booming Ground Writers Community. Her first book of fiction, Dead Girls, was named Book of the Year by Now magazine and was a finalist for the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize and the Danuta Gleed Literary Award. Her work has appeared in numerous literary journals and anthologies, as well as in the 2001 Toronto Life Summer Fiction issue. She was one of 7 writers selected by Margaret Atwood for a special CBC radio feature on new writers to watch, and a jury member for the CBC's Canada Reads program for 2003. She's the recipient of many grants, fellowships, and writing awards, including the Gabriel Award for Radio. And she is currently an instructor at the UBC's Creative Writing M.F.A. program. Her first novel, The Age, was published by McClellan and Stewart last year in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Lee.
Thank you so much, Heidi. That was a lovely introduction. Took me back through the years. It's so great to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming and for staying when you found out there was no wine. So last fall, I had the pleasure of adjudicating a writing competition for high school students as part of the Kingston Writers Festival in Kingston, Ontario. And at the awards ceremony, where we presented awards to 3 high school writers, I was there with them. We were in the green room waiting to go up into the theaters full of parents and people come to watch the awards. And I thought, well, I've got these teens here captive with me for half an hour. I'm going to talk to them and find out what is going on in the mind of teens today. So So I started prying and asking questions. And the things they talked about were, there are no jobs left. It's impossible to buy a house. Why am I going to university? What's it going to get me? All those kind of things. And finally, one of them said, you know, oh, the environment, that was a huge one. The environment is going down the drain. What are we going to do? How are we going to save the planet? And finally, one of them said, you know, it's like our parents and grandparents totally screwed up this world, and now we have to try to fix it. And I thought, that's exactly how I felt in 1983. So I don't know if you, some of you maybe aren't, I think maybe I will hold this because it sounds a bit crackly. Come here. So I don't know how many of you, maybe some of you are too young to think back to 1983, but if you cast your mind back to 1983, some of you are like, 1983 is like yesterday. You know, it was a troubling time in the world. I can remember I was in grade 8, and on the news every night, we always watched that ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. And every night there were, you know, images of trucks carrying missiles across Europe. I'll move this out of the way too. And Iran was occupying the Strait of Hormuz and stopping the traffic of oil in and out of the Gulf. And there was, of course, the tensions between Iran and Iraq, and they kept speculating every night, would the superpowers get involved, you know, that sort of thing. And because of the age I was too young to remember Vietnam or the Korean War. And we hadn't yet moved into, you know, the Bush era Gulf Wars. And so really, myself and the kids that I hung out with, we had no context for ground war. We didn't really understand what ground war was. You saw it in movies and stuff like that, but really our ideas of war were shaped around escalating international tension, resulting in somebody pushing a button, which would launch some missiles, which would then trigger somebody else pushing a button, which would launch more missiles, and there would be that, you know, what they talked about, mutually assured destruction. So really, you know, when on the news you heard about war, you thought about, oh my God, it's going to be the end of the world. In fact, in my grade 8 social studies class, where we talked about current events every day, one day our teacher was so frustrated with how cynical we all were about everything that he said, look, how many of you think you're going to live past the age of 25? And only half of the class put up their hand. We were convinced that the world was going to end before we reached adulthood. So fast forward a little bit to 2001, post 9/11, and there was a news conference on CNN discussing the military action in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And somebody asked the press secretary, you know, has the president considered the use of nuclear weapons? And the press secretary said, the president always considers the use of nuclear weapons. And 9/11 was kind of a turning point for me, where all that kind of nuclear anxiety that I'd kind of grown up with and that had sort of faded away with glasnost and coming down to the wall and all that stuff, sort of came back again. And I started to think about, what did it mean to grow up in a generation shaped by nuclear anxiety? And what does it mean when the worst years of your life, which I think of as adolescence, the most dangerous years of your life perhaps, are kind of shaped by the fear that the world is going to end. And so that's what this book is about. It's about a girl named Jerry, who's 15, who is convinced that the world is going to end very soon. She's addicted to the news, and she's convinced there's going to be some sort of nuclear event. And through an older friend of hers, Ian, she falls in with this kind of ragtag group of activists. And they have a plan to disrupt a peace rally to try to make a political statement about how doing sit-ins for peace and walks for peace is absolutely ridiculous, because no world leader is ever going to pay attention to people sitting around singing songs and lighting candles. So this is the night before the peace rally, before they're going to do something incredibly dangerous. And Jerry and Ian, well, Ian has invited Jerry to come to this party with him and kind of built it up as their last hurrah of going up together. And Ian's older than Jerry, and Jerry has been thinking throughout the book about perhaps losing her virginity or trying to lose her virginity. So she goes to this party with Ian because she thinks it's kind of their last chance to be together. But when she gets to the party, she discovers that Ian has come to the party because this girl, Lark, is there. Jerry hates Lark. And so she finds herself alone at the party. The music in the living room has mellowed to viscous Floyd, the room glazed with smoke. Bodies clog every pathway, every seat. She leans against the closest wall. Beside her, a row of guys stares blankly forward like suspects in a police lineup. Across the room, Lark and Ian take up most of the couch. He stretches on top of her, kisses her as if trying to pulverize her face. Her arms and legs writhe around him, the limbs of a trapped insect. Jerry shivers. The beer can chills her hands. Lark's skirt rises high over her hip, exposes the bright white of her panties. Jerry watches the guys down the wall, serious eyes, open-mouthed concentration. Young love, the guy beside her leans in as he says it, but he doesn't look at her. His shoulder touches hers. He offers his cigarette, his hand slim, the hair of his forearm peeking out over his wrist. Jerry shakes her head. Smoke tendrils up over his lips. Into his nose, he smiles. He wears a tattered blazer over a faded Who t-shirt, a gray fedora pushed back on his head, his chin and neck dark with stubble. I don't want to watch, but I can't look away. I bet if we went up to the 89 Inn, ate a pizza, and came back, they'd still be going at it. I know them, she says. He thumps the guy beside him with the back of his hand. She knows them. The friend, a Robert Plant wannabe in a denim jacket, hair like an unwashed poodle, gives her a toothy smile and a thumbs up. Farther down the wall, someone hoots as Lark's tanned leg lifts over Ian's hip. Jerry rolls her eyes. I know, the guy beside her nods. Disgraceful, right? She can't place his age, whether he's long out of high school or just looks that way. The guy reaches into his blazer and pulls out a plastic medicine bottle half full of orange liquid. Without breaking his gaze, he unscrews the cap, tips the bottle to his lips. He grimaces as he swallows. Want some? What is it? Bronchitis last week. He points at his neck. Mousy hairs curl up over the edge of his t-shirt. He smells like stale smoke and sweat. The doctor gave me this stuff with codeine. It tastes like shit, but man, it makes you feel like a fucking cloud. He rotates his palms to the ceiling and tilts his head back in a pose that reminds her of Jesus on the cross. She takes the bottle from him, tips it without touching it to her lips. The taste makes her gag. A ball of muscle rolls up in her throat. She worries for a second she'll spray it all over him, then manages to swallow. The vile chemicals sting jitters through her. Gross, right? She nods. Just wait. She drains her beer, let it wash, her mouth clean. Her tongue feels softer, padded. A lightness circles her eyes. Hidden muscles in her face fall slack and untethered. She stares at Ian and Lark, but can't remember what was wrong about watching them. Their bodies churn a slow, perfect machine. Good stuff, right? Her head floats as she nods. Do you want to find a bedroom? She recognizes the words, but not their meaning. What? He cups his hand against her head and speaks right into her. The sound is what she understands, his voice crinkling a paper bag inside her ear. Okay, she says. He leads her by the hand, grips and regrips, tight but tentative. As he walks ahead, he removes his hat, shrinks in front of her. She wonders if by the time they reach the bedroom, he will have disappeared to nothing. The bedroom is a single bed, cramped against a wall with barred windows. An ironing board leans beside the closet door. A thin bedspread drapes the narrow mattress, skims the floor with worn chenille flowers. She can't imagine how they will manage it all in this tiny space. Small talk, kissing, awkward increments of touch, her hands conducting and controlling like traffic signals. Stop, 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 go. And nakedness. For that, she is sure they need a bigger room. She steadies herself, hand on the edge of the bedspread strangely dry and crisp, the mattress boxy, hard, searches for the best place to sit. Near the foot of the bed, he takes off his clothes. Before she can tell him to stop, she's staring at the brush of hair across his chest, the shadowed thatch between his legs, and the pink wrinkled tube that sways as he moves. He wrestles the covers over himself, then holds them open for her. Come on, before the shit wears off. He says it with mock command, a smile on his face. But she senses something folded into the corners of his mouth, an impatience that could make him mean. She undresses with her back to him, her clothes lift away, then drip from her fingertips, her body weightless, blended with the air. The coating floods her with warmth. She slips between the cover and a pilly flannel sheet, startles at the bristly touch of his skin. Whoa, he says. His smile spreads as he climbs on top of her. His hip bones pry her legs apart, side to side. He pauses to cough into his hand, murmurs an apology. She closes her eyes, tries not to focus on each dry, rubbery prod, tries to think only of the high, the sparkle in her face, the marshmallowy hump of pillow beneath her neck. She feels grateful to the owners of the room, whoever they are, as the faded scent of their lemon detergent rises from the sheets, brightens the stale cigarette funk of the room. Even the cough syrup's backwash distracts her as she rolls her tongue in her mouth and calls up its bitterness. Repetition wears her down, the chafe and drag of skin on skin. With each thrust, his moans loosen, and raw pain makes her think of meat in a butcher shop being thumped by a mallet. His body smell, musky with nerves and unwashed parts, wafts up through gaps in the bedding, clouds her face. But it's the rhythm that unhinges her, its regularity and irritation to her muscles, her teeth, her cells. He vibrates and whimpers on top of her. His wetness burns. She winces and rolls away from him, stuffs the sheet between her legs, and presses back the sting. Everything inside her pulses, flayed. Are you okay? He says. She wipes herself with the sheet, afraid to look down at the mess she might be leaving. I'm going to get dressed. The elastic of her panties nicks at her thighs, her t-shirt tangles, the legs of her jeans twist, as if she got into bed one size and came out another. You want a cigarette? She opens the door, relieved to fall into the noise of the party, calmed by the faces, the smoke, the light. ZZ Top at full volume. The living room has become a dance floor, guys with beer bottle hands, feet planted, their shoulders winged to no particular beat. The girls are the show. They wiggle their hips, lips pursed as they shake their hair. Two girls jump on the couch as if it's a trampoline. Ian's nowhere in sight. Jerry checks the kitchen, then takes her place alone against the living room wall. After a few minutes, the guy shuffles in beside her, fedora crushed low on his head. So, hey, I need to find my friend and get out of here. His eyes flit from the blank space on one side of her head to the blank space on the other. There's this other party. He shrugs. I'd invite you, but it's kind of a private thing. She nods, afraid to look at him, to see and possibly remember his face. I'll take that cigarette. He feels inside his jacket. His hand comes out empty. I don't have that many left. Like I said, I've got this other party. Forget it. She pushes away from the wall, lurches for the kitchen, the back door, beer and cough syrup crawling up in her throat. His voice trails behind her. Oh, come on, don't be that way. The back steps are empty except for a girl crying into the shoulder of another girl. Jerry gulps the cold air, steals past them to a cement path that leads to a garage and a long stretch of yard. A tire swing dangles from a low tree branch. Plastic trucks crouch in the unmown lawn. She staggers to the back. A sickly fence separates grass from alley, torn, splintered pickets, gaps like blackened teeth. Pickets at her head, she lies down, searches for the stars. Dark, woolly clouds hide the night, keep the moon from view. Each time she closes her eyes, the earth spins like a turntable. She claws at the grass, pulls up mounds of turf, cold clay soil. The damp ground cools her back as she waits for the change, to feel newly emboldened, empowered, brimming with the cocky nerve that marked experienced girls on TV. The only sensation she can pinpoint is a thick, wet swelling between her legs and a rash along her jaw from the scuff of his stubble, her high dropping off into a pit. If anything, she feels hulled, as if there is less of her. She gives it a good 20 minutes, waits through Ian twice calling her name from the back porch before deciding her experiment is a failure. A nagging, embarrassed heat plays out behind her eyes, and she tries to fill herself with dewy air, swallow the ground's loamy smell to keep herself from crying.
So I'm actually going to ask you to come back and Jackie to come up, and we have time now for some questions from the audience.
I want to know, was it just codeine or was it LSD they took?
Oh, it was just codeine. It was just codeine and cough syrup. Oh, LSD would have been good.
It sounded like LSD. I didn't know codeine was so potent.
I do love a bit of codeine, sorry. I don't have any now, yes, I would share it if I had it.
Yes.
So, lady over here, which part of London did you live? And for how long?
Which part of London did I live?
Yeah.
Well, I worked in London for a few years.
What's that?
I lived, Kensal Rise, Golders
Kensal.
Green,
Kensal Rise.
Eltham. I lived south and north, all over really. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I used to live in Notting Hill Gate.
Notting Hill Gate. Oh, that's posh.
Yes.
The place I was in was not posh.
Yeah.
Where is your killer killing people in London? All over as well?
Notting Hill Gate.
Inside. Notting Hill Gate was very, no, Soho was where Savour is set. And I used to work in Soho for a couple of
You worked in
years.
South Bank too?
I used to hang out in the South Bank quite a lot, yeah. And when I go back to London every couple of years, I always sort of migrate to the South Bank.
Yeah,
Like
it's a great place.
yeah, yeah. London's just so big and sprawling, lots of places to hide. Yeah.
I don't think London's a crime place.
Ooh, Jack the Ripper. Oh, you better be kidding.
Just because, except for a few notorious things,
Yeah.
that's all one time. Something to do with it.
Yeah.
Well, I lived in not Soho, but I lived in London in the late 70s, and believe me, it was an incredibly violent place.
It's violent, it's violent. But
Yeah.
I don't see it as being a murder place.
Why do you choose to set your characters in London and not in Canada?
Not
Yeah.
in Canada?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, good question. Well, this is the first book, Nondescript Rambunctious, is set in a small town in the Highlands of Scotland. Because I've got a lot of family from Scotland and I lived there for many years as well. And I always found...
Is that a crime story too?
Yeah, it's the first in the trilogy. And I've always loved the Highlands, very sort of atmospheric and, it's kind of almost a perfect setting for a crime
For a
novel
crime?
in a way. Yeah, obviously you don't think so. But I like the sort of small town sort of dark, small town, lots of things seething beneath the surface. So that's where the first book was set. And at the end of the first book, sorry if this is a spoiler, they get on the train. I'm going to spoil it. And they go to London. And so that's where Sabre picks up.
It would be possible to do a book about the serial killing in West Van.
We could start
How do you know?
Christine has a question. I'm interested in that. Is there a setting? Is that part of the book too?
It's set in Vancouver. And in fact, North Van plays a huge part in this book. The book is told in two parts, and so one part, the part I read tonight, was the main part, which is Jerry and her teenage life in 1984, which is in Vancouver. But then the second part of the book is Jerry's fantasy of surviving a nuclear attack, and in that fantasy, they actually end up in Deep Cove, in a little community that they forged. So if any of you want to read about what Deep Cove will be like after nuclear attack, it's in this book. The residents of Deep Cove don't actually fare so well, but this band of people who infiltrate fare quite well. So, but yes, both my books are actually set. My first book is also set in Vancouver, and so I'm curious to know, for you, Jackie, did you find it easier to write about England once you were living here?
Oh, I don't know, in a way. I mean, I suppose any writing is based on a little bit to do with personal experiences.
Yes.
And so your past and where you've lived in the past sort of shapes what you write about. So in a way, I guess so, yeah, because it's all part of my history. Yeah, but it works both ways, I suppose, because when you're in a place, you can get the observations in real time. Yeah.
I think the gentleman in the green.
Is it all right if I ask two questions?
Yes, it is.
The first one is for Jackie. With your writing, how many perspectives are in your book? Because you sound like you're writing from third person limited for most of the characters. When you were differentiating them in your head, how did you come up with each of their vernaculars when they're talking about the world and London in general?
Yeah. Well, the first book was written purely in first person, and I switched perspectives between the four main characters, and they're all so different that you know, and speak very differently, that you get that sort of difference between them. So when I write a chapter, it's all within that person's head, and you sort of get into character and become that person, write it. In Sabre, I switch actually between first person, because I felt that was quite important to keep for Oliver, the main killer. So it's good to be inside his head. And third person, just to make things extra complicated for myself. Because I found writing in first person absolutely exhausting and a little bit limiting. And so I ended up switching in this book, and I found it kind of released me a little bit and made it a bit more interesting to write. So, how do you find writing different perspectives?
I'm just sort of reflecting back, because I spent so long working on the book that the two different storylines, I think originally the fantasy section was actually in the second person, you do this, you do that, and that was exhausting to maintain and to make the you not so obvious. So I ended up actually shifting that section into third person. So both of the sections were in third person. In my story collection, I kind of tried all sorts of different points of view: first person, third person, second person, just kind of play around. You can do that sort of thing in a story collection, sort of experiment. Yeah. I think really, you know, with my students, I always kind of encourage them to just write in whichever point of view feels is going to get you most connected to the story. You know, you can always rework it later on, but if you feel a connection writing as a character, then do it that way. Or if you feel writing about a character is easier, then do it that way.
Can That's my second
question.
This one is for you, Nancy. How closely did you work with Margaret Atwood, and have you ever had the chance to have her as your editor for a piece that you've done?
No, the closest I've gotten to Margaret Atwood, I have two Margaret Atwood stories. One is that we were at a festival together. When my first book came out, it was one of the first festivals I ever did. I got invited to the Commonwealth Festival, which was held in Manchester. And I was on a panel with Margaret Atwood about the state of Canadian literature. I don't know if you can imagine how crazy that is for a first-time writer to be on a panel with Margaret Atwood and have a moderator asking you each to answer the same question. I basically answered every question by saying, I defer to Margaret Atwood. I honestly could not say anything better than Margaret Atwood. So we had coffee after that, and then we walked back to the hotel together and chatted along the way. So that was my Margaret Atwood experience. Years later, I was at another festival in Paris, and we were at a party at the French embassy. And Margaret Atwood was there, but this time with an entourage of people who kind of swooped in. It was like the partying for the Queen sort of thing. And while we were there, my husband, who was also a writer, and we were both there together, we were staying with another writer, and my husband was saying, you should go say hi, you should go say hi. And I was like, no, it's Margaret Atwood. She doesn't want people to bother her while she's here. And then finally, as she was leaving, she sort of came past us, and our eyes met, and I thought, well, now I have to say hi. So I stepped forward. It was like a stepping forward to see the Queen, you know. Everybody had kind of parted, and we were standing there, and we were making nice, and she said, how are you enjoying your stay? I said, lovely. And she said, where are you staying? And we were staying at a little boutique hotel, and it was called L'Hôtel Le Home. Now, in France, I think as in Quebec, they often take Anglo words and put a French article in front of it, like le hot dog. Right? So this was called Le Home. That's what the name of it was. So I said to her, we're staying at L'Hôtel Le Home. And she looked at me, she said, Nancy, it's L'Hôtel de l'Homme. And then she swept off, having corrected my perfectly correct French. So that's my Margaret Atwood story. And I wanted to scream after her, no, it isn't! So now Margaret Atwood thinks I don't know how to speak French, which I don't really, but you want Margaret Atwood to think that. I have kept, I'm not lying, I have kept a business card from that boutique hotel since then. For the moment that I see Margaret Atwood again. Just say, here's the card from that hotel I was staying at.
You know what, this is going to be recorded.
Oh no! I forgot that it was going to be videotaped.
We'll tweet at her.
Oh!
See? Any other questions?
Actually, that's a good question, because I mean, in terms of what you've both written, dare I say they're kind of classic stories, right? And you look at the modern idiom being phones, selfies. Have you both thought about that as kind of a way, a means of being able to think? I mean, just imagine, a killer going around with selfies. But, I mean, has that ever crossed your mind?
Yeah, it has. It did cross my mind because there's an awful lot of narcissism and selfies and killers in recent times posting videos of themselves doing very bad things. You probably would know what I'm talking about there. But the killer in my book actively doesn't want that. That's not what he's about. He's not after the notoriety of killing. So he doesn't have that narcissism about him. And so he's very much under the radar. And those are the people that I found sort of more terrifying in a way, because they're the people that, they never get found out. And they're the people that we hear about. We hear about them on the news every week.
At the end of the day.
Every week, someone's done something absolutely horrific in the world somewhere. So if they're the people that we know about and they get reported about, how many of them aren't? That is something that I found really interesting and always have found interesting. And in this day and age, it's much more prolific to show off about the bad things that you're doing. Yeah, it is an interesting thing.
I think I purposely, because it's 1984 and pre-technology, that made it so much more convenient. You know, had the same story been set now, I mean, you know, there are just so many things you have to work in. And my next book is a crime novel, and I'm kind of purposely setting it around 1996 because I need there to be spotty internet. You know, if everyone can get on their smartphone and immediately, you know, Google track somebody, it's almost like, it's not that you don't want the characters to have those conveniences, but you know that readers will demand you almost show them going through the motions, and that stuff is just so boring to write, you know, so you did a search for so,
yes,
you know, and that sort of thing. So, so I don't know, I mean, I know that a lot of my students who, you know, obviously much younger and hipper than me, manage to weave technology into their work quite seamlessly, and I think it's because in their lives it is a seamless process. It's not something they maybe bring a lot of conscious thought to the way we do. You know, it's just how people live now, and so I feel like I'm kind of leaving it to the younger generation to tackle, you know, how Tinder and Tumblr and all of that plays out in fiction. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm nervous even putting the word Starbucks in a book. You know, I kind of feel like there are certain things that, you know, they're incredibly relevant now, but how relevant are they going to be? I mean, this is maybe a bit narcissistic of me to think that anyone will be reading this decades from now, but you know, there's a kind of, the literature that I really admire has a timeless quality to it, so I feel like when you start bringing all those things in, then all of a sudden it kind of brands the stories happening at a certain time. Somebody cried.
It's okay. One more question we have time for. Oh, I think you were first.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment to tell you how much I enjoyed listening to both of you read. This is the first time I've attended an author series, and it's been very enjoyable. And I love to sort of meet you and see some of your personalities, so when I read your books, that's going to make it that much better for me. So thank you.
All right, so we have one last question.
Just a question about the fact that you're writing a trilogy, Jack is writing a trilogy, and it's your first 3 books. Is that a problem? Because I love
yes.
I love the challenge in the second book, but obviously what happens to Helen in the second book is partly determined by what's happening in the first book. And I think you're very good at those. I think you're improving. So is that a problem?
Yeah, just no one ever write a trilogy ever. I'm just a little bit stupid. Yeah, I mean, it's been a wild ride. I didn't set out to write a trilogy from the very beginning. Some people, I think, map them out and spend years writing them properly, but I didn't. I wrote my first book as a standalone book, and then a lot of people sort of wanted to know what happened to them when they left Scotland, you know, and because I left it, there was no sort of firm resolution or, you know, any kind of ending, happy ending. And so I kept saying, no, it's a standalone book, and, you know, get over it. It's no resolution. And then when I came to sort of sit and start writing a new book, I couldn't help it. I had to sort of start in London with Lizzie, and thought, oh, what did happen to her? And then it sort of came from there. And then at the same time, I had this idea for the grand finale, the very ending. And so I thought, oh, it's a trilogy. And then got quite excited about it. Yeah.
Where's the
And
downside?
then I had to do a little bit of planning. But the downside is it's just really hard. Yeah.
I can vouch for that. I just have to say.
Jackie does almost all of her writing here at the library. Oh. And so I see her all the time in the morning looking very, like she's working really, really hard. She does work very hard.
I do.
Yes. Nancy, can you tell us just a little bit more about your book that you're working on right now?
Oh, I hate to talk about things while I'm working on them, but what can I tell you? Well, I can tell you this. So my first book, Dead Girls, is a collection of stories about a serial killer in the downtown east side. My second book, The Age, is about nuclear anxiety and a post-apocalyptic nuclear, surviving a nuclear war. So for my third book, I thought I want to write something dark. And I've always loved murder mysteries, thrillers. They're my guilty pleasure, especially in film and kind of artistic television, like the BBC Wallander series, you know, where you get that kind of combination of incredible imagery along with a compelling mystery. And I began to think, well, maybe for my third book I would write something that actually was fun. It's often a surprise when people find out writing's not all that much fun. It's a lot of hard work. But I thought, well, maybe I could write a story that, you know, felt like a kind of guilty pleasure. So I thought I'd do that. And I was reading some books, I was kind of looking into the idea of the genre, and I read a book by Patricia Highsmith where she talks about the difference between a mystery and a thriller, which was a mystery is about, you know, who committed, you're trying to find out who committed a murder and solve the crime, but a thriller is about looking into the nature of evil. And I thought, that sounds good. I'd like to look into the nature of evil. I mean, I think I'm a lot like you in that, you know, if somebody says dead bodies, I'm like, oh, tell me more. Dead bodies, that sounds fascinating. So, I'm writing a standalone murder story. It's not a trilogy. People are murdered, and some poor sap has to find out, a reluctant poor sap has to find out who is at the bottom of it all. And it's going to, I think, carry a lot of the themes of my first two books. I tend to write around feminist themes, so a lot of that's going to come out as well. Sort of maybe trying to turn the genre a little bit in terms of feminist ideas. So that's all I'm going to tell you.
Well, hopefully you two can try to publish your next books like around the same time, and then come back and do a second reading. Thank you both so much. That was really, really great. Let's give them a round of applause. Jackie and Nancy are selling their books in the back there, and I'm sure they'd be happy to sign books, so please feel free to buy books. And I'd also like to thank the North Shore Writers Association, our partner in this series. They're so fabulous. And thank you all very much for coming. We'll see you next time.